When Caligula became emperor, he did something no Roman had ever done before. He put his sisters' faces on coins and their names in sacred oaths, giving them more power than any women in the history of Rome. But what he did to those same sisters behind closed doors was something the ancient world could barely put into words. This is the story of Caligula and his three sisters, and it is far darker than history admits. Look at the ancient statues of Rome. Look at the white marble. Looks clean, cold, and perfect. But if those stone walls could scream, the sound would shatter the empire. Because once you see what power did to this family, what it twisted, and what it broke, you will never look at the word brother the same way again. The boy who would become Caligula was born into the most beloved family in Rome. His father, Germanicus, was the empire's golden general, adored by soldiers and citizens alike. His mother, Agrippina the elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself. They had 9 children. 6 survived infancy. 3 boys, 3 girls. The perfect Roman family. The ultimate hope of an entire empire. And then, Rome destroyed every single one of them. It started with Germanicus, poisoned in Syria. The golden general died at 33, and all of Rome wept. But the emperor Tiberius didn't weep. Tiberius watched, and then he turned his cold attention to the helpless family that remained. Agrippina the elder, Caligula's own mother, was too outspoken, too popular, too much of a living reminder that Rome loved Germanicus more than they loved their own emperor. Tiberius had her dragged away in chains, arrested, and exiled to a barren, sun-scorched island. There, alone in the dirt, she was starved. Some accounts say she tried to refuse food on her own terms, so the guards beat her, forcing the food down her throat just to prolong her agony. She died in total darkness. Next came the brothers. Nero Caesar, the oldest, was arrested on false charges, exiled, and driven to take his own life. But what about the second brother? Drusus, locked away in the pitch-black dungeons beneath the imperial palace itself. He starved slowly, day after day, desperately clawing at the stone walls. Ancient sources record something too horrific to fully imagine. Near the very end, he was so consumed by absolute hunger that he tried to eat the stuffing from his own filthy mattress. He died the exact same year as his mother. 3 family members dead. All within a few years. All systematically destroyed by the emperor who was supposed to protect them. And Caligula? How did he survive? Not because Tiberius liked him. No. But because Tiberius found him useful. The old emperor summoned the terrified teenage boy to his villa on Capri, that infamous island retreat where Tiberius spent his final years surrounded by pure cruelty and unspeakable excess. This was the classroom that shaped Caligula. Not philosophy, not military strategy, not the virtues Rome claimed to cherish. No. He learned surveillance, he learned manipulation, and he learned the absolute certainty that anyone who shows what they really feel will be destroyed for it. He smiled at the man who murdered his mother. He laughed with the guards who starved his brothers, because to show a single tear meant death. Through all of it, through the deaths and the exile and the island of horrors, 3 people remained. 3 sisters who had survived the exact same nightmare. Agrippina the younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. They were all he had left. The only family that hadn't been torn away. The only human beings on earth who understood what it meant to watch your parents and brothers be erased from existence. Remember that, because what Caligula did to those sisters, whether you call it love, or obsession, or something far more disturbing, it came from that exact bond. It came from the shared trauma of being the last one standing. In March of 37 AD, Tiberius dies. The boy from Capri is suddenly the master of Rome. He is 24 years old, and his very first act tells you everything about the dark obsession that rules his mind. He brings his sisters home. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe and share to support the channel. The young emperor returned to Rome, and the city rejoiced. They saw a savior. They saw the son of their beloved general. But they did not see the broken boy who had just left the island of horrors. They did not see the darkness taking root in his mind. Caligula's very first act shattered centuries of Roman tradition. He did not look to the hardened generals of the army. He did not look to the powerful old men of the Senate. No. He looked only to his 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, Livilla. They were the survivors. They were his blood. And he was determined to lift them higher than any women had ever stood in the history of the world. Suddenly, the entire empire was forced to bow to them. Caligula ordered the mints to change the money. For the first time in Roman history, living women were stamped onto imperial coins. Imagine the shock of the Roman citizen, holding a silver coin and staring at the faces of 3 young girls. On one side, the cold profile of the emperor. On the other side, his sisters, depicted as goddesses. Goddesses of security, goddesses of harmony, goddesses of fortune. The message was unmistakable. They were not just his family, they were the state itself. But Caligula did not stop there. He wanted their names burned into the mind of every single Roman. He altered the sacred oaths of the empire. Every soldier marching on the borders, every senator standing in the Capitol, every citizen protecting his home, had to swear a new oath. I will hold myself and my children no dearer than I do Gaius and his sisters. Think about the sheer weight of those words. An entire empire, millions of lives, swearing to die for the safety of 3 sisters. Their names were spoken in the same breath as the ruler of the world. They were given the legal privileges of the Vestal Virgins, the most sacred, untouchable women in Rome. They sat in the finest seats at the games. They watched the gladiators from the imperial box. They walked with terrifying authority. To the public, it looked like a golden age of family devotion. It looked beautiful. It looked glorious. But behind the bright marble pillars, inside the long winding corridors of the Grand Palace, a suffocating trap was closing in. The honors were not a gift. They were a cage. Caligula had elevated them to the heavens, so that no one else on earth could ever reach them. No one else could ever touch them. No one else could ever take them away. The whispers started almost immediately. What was happening when the heavy wooden doors of the palace swung shut? What was happening when the public left and the lamps burned low? The ancient world was a place of excess, a place used to violence and sin, but what Caligula was doing to his own flesh and blood, what he was demanding of them in the dark, was something so twisted that the historians could barely find the words to write it down. The elevation was complete, and the nightmare was about to begin. But among the 3 sisters, there was one who received something more, something that went far beyond political honor, and entered a territory that made even the most hardened Romans deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Julia Drusilla. She was born just 1 year after Caligula. They had crawled together, played together, survived the same terror together, and lost absolutely everything together. And when Caligula became the undisputed master of Rome, he did not just honor her alongside her sisters. No. He separated her from the rest. He elevated her. He treated her differently from any other human being in his life. At first, he tried to play the role of a normal Roman brother. He arranged a marriage for Drusilla with his close friend, Lucius Cassius Longinus, a former consul, a highly respectable match, a standard political alliance. It was normal, safe, expected. And then he took her back. Not secretly, not gradually, but with a terrifying, absolute suddenness. He simply marched into their lives, removed Drusilla from her husband's household, and installed her directly into the imperial palace. The ancient historian Suetonius records the scandal with absolute horror. He writes that Caligula treated Drusilla, his own biological sister, as his lawful wife. Think about the sheer madness of it. At the grand imperial banquets, where the entire Roman aristocracy watched with bated breath, Drusilla did not sit with the ladies. No, she sat right beside the emperor. She was placed in the sacred position reserved exclusively for the empress. While Caligula's actual legal wives were pushed aside, humiliated, forced to watch. She lived with him, she traveled with him, she appeared with him at every major event. She held a status that no sister should ever hold in human society, and the streets of Rome began to whisper. But Caligula did not care about the whispers. In his mind, he was a god, and gods do not follow the laws of mortal men. He eventually forced a divorce, and remarried Drusilla to Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, his absolute closest friend and political ally. On the surface, it looked like a brilliant strategic move. Lepidus was powerful, well-connected, a direct descendant of Augustus himself. But inside the dark walls of the palace, nothing changed. Drusilla still belonged to the emperor. Lepidus had a wife in name only, while Caligula possessed her in every other way imaginable. Imagine the psychological torment of that palace. Imagine being Lepidus, married to the most powerful woman in Rome, and yet your wife lives in her brother's quarters, sleeps under her brother's roof, functions as her brother's companion in every visible way. Everyone at court knew it, everyone in Rome whispered about it, and nobody dared to say a single word, because the man at the center of it all was the emperor, and emperors do not share what is theirs. And what about Drusilla? What did she feel? Caught between a husband and a monstrous brother? Between what society expected and what the most powerful man on earth demanded? Did she choose this life? Did she want it? Did she have any choice at all? When the emperor takes you from your home, when he locks you in his palace, the word no ceases to exist. Not for a senator, not for a general, and certainly not for a sister. The obsession was deepening, hardening, and it was about to push the entire empire to the absolute brink of ruin. Then, the universe itself seemed to crack. In October of 37 AD, just 7 short months into his spectacular reign, Caligula collapsed. A sudden, desperate, and terrifying illness took hold of his body. The ancient palace grew deathly quiet. Some modern historians believe it was a violent onset of epilepsy. Others whisper that it was a total nervous breakdown, the crushing, accumulated weight of a lifetime of trauma and loss finally bursting through the surface. Whatever it was, Rome believed its young emperor was dying. The entire empire held its breath. Citizens wept openly in the streets, sacrifices were offered at every altar. Thousands slept outside the palace gates just waiting for a sign of life. And inside the imperial bedchamber, sweating, shaking, and staring directly into the eyes of death, Caligula made a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire ancient world. He wrote his final will, and he named Drusilla as his sole heir. Think about the absolute madness of this act. This was Rome, a fiercely patriarchal empire that had never, ever, allowed a woman to rule. The concept was completely alien. It was forbidden. He did not name a legendary general. He did not name a brilliant senator. He did not choose a male cousin or adopt a powerful son. No. He bypassed every man in the empire and left everything, his vast wealth, his unstoppable armies, the entire Roman Empire, to his 21-year-old sister. In that ultimate moment, when the pretense of politics was stripped away, when death was scratching at the door, the only human being Caligula trusted with the universe was Drusilla. It proves, beyond any doubt, that she was his anchor. She was the only thing keeping his fractured mind tethered to reality. But Caligula did not die. Against all odds, he recovered. He stood up from his sickbed, but the boy who walked out of that room was no longer the generous young ruler Rome had loved. Something fundamental had broken inside his mind. The illness marks the exact turning point of his reign. The monster emerged. The executions started. The paranoia accelerated. The terrifying claims of divinity began. But his grip on Drusilla? It only grew tighter, more suffocating, more absolute. She was his constant, the one fixed point in a world he was rapidly tearing apart. And then, the ultimate blow fell. On June 10, 38 AD, Drusilla died. She was only 21 years old. It wasn't an assassin's blade, it wasn't a calculated poisoning, it was likely a brutal epidemic sweeping through the crowded streets of Rome. A simple fever. The kind of sudden death that imperial power is utterly helpless to stop. Caligula did not just grieve, he shattered completely. His mind snapped like dry glass. What followed was a spectacle of complete psychological collapse that Rome watched with absolute horror. He declared a period of public mourning, but this was not a normal time of sadness. No. He made it a capital crime to laugh. He made it a capital crime to bathe, or to eat dinner with your own parents, your own spouse, your own children. If you smiled in the city of Rome, you could be executed on the spot. If you washed your body, you were dragged to the executioner. If you shared a meal with your family, you paid with your life. An entire superpower, paralyzed by one man's monstrous grief. He could not bear to look at the palace where she had lived. In the dead of night, without warning, he fled the capital. He drove through the countryside in a total frenzy, sailed to Sicily, and then turned around and raced back just as suddenly. He refused to shave, he refused to cut his hair. He wandered the halls like a hollow ghost, wearing his agony for the world to see. He went before the terrified Senate and demanded that Drusilla be made a goddess. Not honored, a goddess. Equal to Venus, equal to Minerva. The Senate, trembling with fear, obeyed. She became the universal goddess. She received her own grand temple, her own priests, her own sacred games. A senator even swore under oath that he saw her soul flying up to heaven, and Caligula rewarded him with a fortune. He refused to let her go, and that refusal, that absolute inability to live in a world without her, was about to turn his remaining family into a living hell. But Caligula still had two sisters left, Agrippina and Livilla. They were still alive, still walking the marble halls of the court, still bearing the staggering public honors he had given them. You might think that losing Drusilla would make him hold his remaining family closer. You might think his overwhelming grief would make him cling desperately to what was left. You would be dead wrong. Because what Caligula did to Agrippina and Livilla after Drusilla's death was not love, it was punishment, it was raw, unadulterated rage. He looked at them, and his twisted mind filled with absolute venom. Why were they still breathing? Why were they still walking under the sun, when the only sister who mattered to him was rotting in a tomb? The brother who once put their faces on gold coins now looked at them with ice-cold contempt. The ancient sources record that he began to degrade them systematically, pushing them into deeply inappropriate arrangements with his own favorites, treating the proud granddaughters of Augustus like currency to buy the loyalty of his inner circle. But Agrippina and Livilla were not helpless victims. No, they were the fierce daughters of Germanicus. They carried the ultimate imperial blood, and they had survived the exact same horrific childhood as Caligula. They had watched their mother starve, they had heard of their brother eating his own mattress in the dark, and they had learned the ultimate rule of the survival in the palace. When you are trapped in a cage with a monster, you either strike first, or you die. They chose to strike. Sometime in 39 AD, just a year after Drusilla's death, a deadly, silent alliance was formed. The sisters approached Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the very man who had been married to their dead sister Drusilla. Lepidus was Caligula's closest friend, the man the emperor trusted above all others, and the man everyone believed would take the throne if Caligula fell. But the betrayal went deeper, into layers of pure psychological horror. The ancient historians whisper that Lepidus was sleeping with both sisters at the same time. Agrippina and Livilla were sharing their dead sister's husband, while plotting to use his power to murder their own brother. Think about the sheer madness of this treason. Every single bond Caligula thought he possessed was an absolute lie. The sisters he elevated, the best friend he loved, were whispering in the dark, choosing the exact weapons to pierce his heart. History calls this conspiracy the plot of the three daggers. It almost worked, but Caligula was not just a madman, he was a survivor. He had been raised by Tiberius on the island of Capri. He knew how to smell blood in the air. In the autumn of 39 AD, while he was away with his legions on the northern frontier, the plot was exposed. The evidence was absolute: handwritten letters, meticulous plans detailing the exact time and place of his assassination. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Lepidus was executed on the spot. No trial, no final words, just a cold blade to the neck of the emperor's favorite friend. But for his sisters, Caligula wanted something far worse than a quick death. He wanted a public, agonizing humiliation that would break their spirits forever. He forced Agrippina, his own sister, to carry the heavy urn containing Lepidus's ashes all the way back to Rome. Imagine that horrific march. Walking for hundreds of miles on foot, down the dusty roads, holding the burnt bones of her lover, her co-conspirator, the man who was supposed to save her. The emperor's soldiers watched her every step. The crowd stared in dead silence, a living, breathing warning to anyone who dared to cross the master of Rome. And at the end of that brutal road, there was no mercy. Caligula banished both Agrippina and Livilla to the remote, barren, sun-scorched Pontine Islands. The exact same isolation that had killed their mother. The cycle of family horror had repeated itself perfectly. He stood before the Senate, eyes wild with triumph, and delivered a chilling message that echoed across the entire empire. I don't just have islands, I also have swords. Left alone on those barren rocky islands, separated from each other, Agrippina and Livilla could only listen to the distant, terrifying echoes of what Rome was becoming. Back in the capital, without a single family member left to anchor him, Caligula unraveled completely. The absolute final restraints on his mind snapped. The cruelty turned into a living theater of the absurd. He forced elderly senators to run for miles beside his golden chariot, sweating and panting in their heavy togas, just for his amusement. He opened a state-run brothel inside the sacred walls of the imperial palace itself, forcing noble women and aristocratic youths into degrading roles while he personally collected the profits at the door. He declared himself a living, breathing god, ordering the heads of ancient Greek statues to be chopped off and replaced with his own likeness. He would dress up as Jupiter, as Venus, as Mars, and wander the palace, loudly arguing with the statue of Jupiter, claiming they were equals. He was entirely consumed by the ghost of Drusilla. When his wife gave birth to a daughter, he named the infant Julia Drusilla. He carried the tiny baby to the temples of Rome, one by one, and finally placed her directly into the lap of the stone statue of Minerva, begging the goddess to raise his child. He was looking for his lost sister in everything, and punishing the world because he could not find her. Anyone who looked at him wrong, anyone who failed to cheer loud enough at his theatrical performances, vanished into the execution chambers. Rome endured this waking nightmare for 2 agonizing years, and then, the guard decided that the monster had to bleed. On January 24, 41 AD, in a narrow dark passageway beneath the imperial palace, the blades found him. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard whom Caligula had mocked for years, struck the first blow. The other conspirators closed in, screaming, striking again and again, 30 times. The emperor who claimed to be a god died in the dirt, crying out in terror. But the violence did not stop with him. The guards raced through the palace to erase his entire line. They found his wife, and slaughtered her. Then, they found the baby, little Julia Drusilla, barely 2 years old. They grabbed the infant by her feet, and slammed her head against the stone wall. The last Julia Drusilla died the exact same way the first one did, violently young, a broken symbol of her father's twisted mind. With Caligula dead, his uncle Claudius was dragged from behind a curtain and declared emperor. His very first act of mercy was to recall Agrippina and Livilla from their lonely exile. But the palace they returned to was not a place of safety, it was a viper's nest. Livilla's fate came swiftly. Claudius's powerful and vicious young wife, Messalina, looked at Livilla and saw a deadly rival. Livilla was beautiful, popular, and carried the pure blood of Germanicus. Messalina fabricated a scandalous charge of adultery between Livilla and the philosopher Seneca. Claudius, entirely controlled by his wife, signed the decree. Livilla was banished once again. This time, there would be no rescue. In late 41 AD, the soldiers arrived at her prison island. They did not use a sword. They locked the doors, and they starved her. The exact same slow, agonizing death her mother had suffered. Livilla was only 24 years old. The girl whose face had been stamped on coins as the goddess of fortune, faded into a forgotten ghost. But Agrippina? Agrippina survived. Because Agrippina was a monster in her own right. She did not hide in fear, she did not retreat into the shadows. She watched Livilla die, she watched Messalina self-destruct, and then, she made her move. She seduced her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. She married him, shocking the entire Roman world with the incestuous alliance. Agrippina did not want love, she wanted absolute vengeance. She controlled Claudius, forced him to adopt her son from a previous marriage, a boy named Nero, and when the time was right, she fed Claudius a plate of poisoned mushrooms. She watched him die, and placed her teenage son Nero onto the throne of the world. She stood right behind Nero, whispering the commands, pulling the strings, controlling the empire just as Caligula had tried to do with Drusilla. But the cycle of this cursed bloodline could not be broken. Nero grew to hate his controlling mother. He tried to sink her in a collapsing boat, she swam ashore. He tried to poison her, she had the antidote. Finally, he sent assassins with heavy iron swords to her villa. As the blades were drawn, Agrippina looked at the soldiers and delivered her final, terrifying words. "Strike the womb that bore him." 3 sisters. 3 horrific fates. Drusilla, the ultimate obsession, dead at 21 from a fever. Livilla, the forgotten one, starved to death in the dark at 24. Agrippina, the brutal survivor, stabbed to death by her own son at 43. The perfect Roman family, the ultimate hope of an empire, completely destroyed from within. 3 sisters walked into Caligula's palace. One became a goddess, one became a ghost, and one became a monster. And the brother who claimed to love them all, left behind nothing but a name that has been synonymous with madness for 2,000 years. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.